Hello, I'm Diana Reich, the Artistic Director of the Charleston Literary Festival based in South Carolina, USA. I would like to welcome you from wherever in the world that you may be watching. If the past fraught 18 months has taught us anything, it has taught us that books and their authors, whether classical or contemporary, really matter. In trying times, readers turn to books for insights into the human condition, for the opportunity to be transported to other worlds, for ideas, for arguments, for inspiration, for experiencing the impossible, for laughter, and for the release of tears. The festival will provide the opportunity to engage with a galaxy of literary and artistic stars, as well as up-and-coming writers who are making waves. We have a far-flung cast list featuring authors from all over the United States, as well as the United Kingdom and elsewhere. Whether they're talking about former literary trailblazers, or gene editing, or human rights, or popular culture, or feminism, or medieval nuns, or innumerable other subjects, they have one thing in common: the ability of compelling stories to linger in our imaginations. We're grateful to all our speakers, whether virtual or in person, for sharing their talents. Please thank them by purchasing their books. The festival couldn't happen without a committed team and board. We would like to thank our donors, both private and public, who generously make the festival possible. The College of Charleston, our academic partner, has been an invaluable source of support. It's no accident that the festival takes place in Charleston, a prime destination with a progressive literary and artistic tradition. Please come and see for yourselves, but make sure to visit during the Charleston Literary Festival, which takes place during the first half of November each year. Meanwhile, I hope that you enjoy the 2021 Charleston Literary Festival and that it makes you think and dream afresh.
Good morning from Charleston, South Carolina. My name is Kerri Forrest. I'll be your interlocutor for today's discussion. And I am delighted and honored to have an opportunity to talk with Yaa Gyasi about her latest book, Transcendent Kingdom. Yaa is a Ghanaian American novelist born in Mamba, Ghana, and raised in Huntsville, Alabama. She holds a bachelor's in English from Stanford University and a master's in fine arts from the Iowa Writers Workshop, where she held a Dean's Graduate Research Fellowship. Her 2016 debut novel, Homegoing, which tells the story of generations of descendants born to an African woman in the 1700s, won numerous awards, including the American Book Award and the PEN Hemingway Award. Her latest novel, Transcendent Kingdom, centers around a family of Ghanaian immigrants living in America who are torn apart by racism, addiction, and depression. The protagonist, Gifty, is a doctoral student in neuroscience looking for answers as to how the brain responds to addiction, and in the process, sorts out the multi-layered trauma suffered by her family, her estranged parents, her addicted brother, and herself, and comes to terms with her own issues of self-acceptance, achievement, and belonging. Published in 2020, the novel was longlisted for the 2021 PEN Faulkner Award for Fiction and the 2021 shortlist for the Women's Prize in Fiction. Yaa Gyasi joins us today from Brooklyn, New York. Yaa, good morning.
Good morning. Hi.
Hi, it's a pleasure to see you in person, and thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thank you, Kerri.
Well, I think I'd love for us to start by having you read the first chapter, because I think it sets the scene for just how complex this relationship is between Gifty and her mother, the main storyline of the book. Would you mind reading that passage for the audience?
I'd be happy to. Thanks again to everyone for being here with us. Whenever I think of my mother, I picture a queen-sized bed with her lying in it, a practiced stillness filling the room. For months on end, she colonized that bed like a virus. The first time, when I was a child, and then again when I was a graduate student. The first time, I was sent to Ghana to wait her out. While there, I was walking through Kejitia Market with my aunt when she grabbed my arm and pointed. Look, a crazy person, she said in Shui. Do you see? A crazy person. I was mortified. My aunt was speaking so loudly, and the man, tall, with dust caked into his dreadlocks, was within earshot. I see, I answered in a low hiss. The man continued past us, mumbling to himself as he waved his hands about in gestures that only he could understand. My aunt nodded, satisfied, and we kept walking past the hordes of people gathered in that agoraphobia-inducing market until we reached the stall where we would spend the rest of the morning attempting to sell knockoff handbags. In my 3 months there, we sold only 4 bags. Even now, I don't completely understand why my aunt singled the man out to me. Maybe, she thought, there were no crazy people in America, that I had never seen one before. Or maybe she was thinking about my mother, about the real reason I was stuck in Ghana that summer, sweating in a stall with an aunt I hardly knew while my mother healed at home in Alabama. I was 11, and I could see that my mother wasn't sick, not in the ways that I was used to. I didn't understand what my mother needed healing from. I didn't understand, but I did. And my embarrassment at my aunt's loud gesture had as much to do with my understanding as it did with the man who had passed us by. My aunt was saying that is what crazy looks like. But instead, what I heard was my mother's name. What I saw was my mother's face, still as lake water, the pastor's hand resting gently on her forehead, his prayer, a light hum that made the room buzz. I'm not sure I know what crazy looks like, but even today, when I hear the word, I picture a split screen, the dreadlocked man in Kejitia on one side, my mother lying in bed on the other. I think about how no one at all reacted to that man in the market, not in fear or disgust, nothing, save my aunt, who wanted me to look. He was, it seemed to me, at perfect peace, even as he gesticulated wildly, even as he mumbled. But my mother, in her bed, infinitely still, was wild inside. I'll stop there.
Thank you. And that line, but my mother in her bed infinitely still was wild inside, is really setting the scene for how Gifty's mother's depression is such a main player in this relationship. But that's only one aspect of the relationships in this story. So I want to delve a little bit deeper, but I want to start by sort of setting the context of the time frame that this book is written in, because again, this is a family that immigrates from Ghana to this small Alabama town. The mother's working for as a nurse for an old white man who is calling her racial slurs. The father is finding himself having to shrink in order to not be intimidating, and has been stopped and frisked at the local store so much that he stops going out. You've got the children who are also being accosted by racial slurs on a regular basis. And this is a racism that's really sort of threaded throughout their existence in Alabama. And so in contrast to Homegoing, which was 1700s to the early 20th, I should say the dawn of the 21st century, help the audience understand what the time frame is here, because we're not talking about the 1950s.
No, we're not talking about the 1950s. This novel kind of exists on a continuum with Homegoing in some ways. Like it could pick up right where Homegoing left off. It's a book that begins in our time, and the scale is much smaller than Homegoing, so it's a more intimate story. But it's set in the present. It's set today. So Gifty's childhood, we're talking 80s and 90s, and now we meet her in the front story in our present day.
Wonderful. So this racism that the family is experiencing, sets in motion these really complex relationships between parents and children, between the spouses themselves, and also between the children. And you have Gifty, her brother Nana, or Buzz, his nickname, and then the mother and father, who are Black Mamba and the Chin Chin Man. So talk to me about the names. First about Gifty and if there's a symbolism in that. And then also talk about what symbolism there is in not giving names to the parents.
Yeah, people always ask about the names, and I feel like I'm cheating you by saying that I didn't really put too much thought into the names. Like, Gifty is my cousin's name, and I've always just thought it was a really pretty name. So I started with Gifty based on that. I think in hindsight, what I started to recognize, thinking about the way subconscious works in creating works of the imagination. In hindsight, I think one thing I find interesting about the name Gifty is that she's being called, a gift, and yet there's this relationship within the family where she's always aware of the fact that, as she puts it, Nana is the true gift. She always knows that he's kind of the favored child. So there's a kind of irony there, that she becomes the sole gift, and yet in some ways she's not the gift that they wanted. She's not the gift that her mother wants. So I think that irony exists under the surface with that naming. But again, it wasn't really intentional. Something that was intentional, though, was leaving the parents unnamed. And in the first draft, I don't know that I really noticed that I hadn't named the characters. I was named those characters. I was so focused on this being in the first person, so being from Gifty's perspective, and I wanted to stay as close as possible to Gifty. So when we're moving through the novel, I wanted it to really be only things that Gifty could have heard, seen, felt, that kind of a thing. And in thinking about that, I was thinking, well, how often, at least in my culture, how often do you call your parents by their first names? Never. How often do you think of your parents by their first names? Never. And so the only opportunities where we could have Gifty's mother named would be hearing other people talk to her. And because this is a novel that's so focused on the kind of isolation that these characters are experiencing, that kind of claustrophobia of not seeing her mother in context with other people, felt more important to me than her overhearing or seeing, for example, her aunt call her mother by her name, or her father call her mother by her name. So again, it's an attempt to kind of keep that lens really, really tight, really tightly focused on Gifty.
Yeah, I think the other thing that I found really interesting with the nicknames, or I should say the names that Gifty as a child would use in her journal to reference her parents, was that it was also very indicative of the type of personalities that she experienced them as. So by calling her mother Black Mamba, which was a very strong, powerful, stern, take no prisoners, this is what we're doing, versus father, who was the Chin Chin Man because of his love of Achomo. I hope I'm pronouncing that, Achomo, and just being a more lighthearted, more engaging, more loving parent. Really, it was interesting to see how the names really personified who they were as well. And I wanted to talk a little bit more about that because there's also in the spousal relationship, the dichotomy between Black Mamba and Chin Chin Man and who they are as individuals and how they raise their kids. But also, in another sense, this really speaks to how society expects Black men, whether it's African or African American, and Black women to be portrayed in society. Would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's interesting that you bring up the nicknames, because you're right. Like, the Black Mamba is not a benign nickname at all. Like, what kind of perception would this young child have to have of her mother to have named her this after a predator, essentially? So there is this kind of this undercurrent of fear, I think, running through that connection. And I find it interesting that Gifty names this in her journal, which feels like the place where she gets to kind of be free or be more vulnerable and talk more honestly. And so she's being honest, but she's using these code names in order to facilitate that honesty. But going back to your question, the relationship between these parents and the depictions that these parents kind of afford us the ability to think through. One thing that I was really interested in with the Chin Chin Man's character were all of these narratives around single parenthood that we see in the Black community here in the States. This idea that that Black fathers are very, very often not around. And in this case, it's true. The Chin Chin Man ends up leaving. But the reason that he leaves, I find to be the place that is most interesting. He leaves because he cannot stand, does not wish to withstand the racism that he's experiencing in this country as an immigrant who came from a place where everyone looked like him to come to America and finally be experiencing anti-Black racism in this specific way is intolerable to him. And so, it kind of subverts that narrative on its head. Like he's not leaving just because he doesn't care about his family or because, he doesn't want to provide for them. He's leaving because the forces of racism, the structural forces of racism in this country are too much to bear. And even in that, it kind of creates the circumstances that we see throughout the rest of the novel. The family starts to kind of fracture because of that leaving. So it has the same effect. But the cause, I think, is clearly a kind of violence in the air, in the weather around him.
Yeah. And I want to come back to that, but let's take a look at Nana first, because as you've already mentioned, Nana takes on near biblical proportions for the mother in this family. You said in one of the passages that he was my mother's Isaac, and mentioned that where the Chin Chin Man was the light bulb, Nana was pure light. And so that really shows the sort of pedestal that particularly Black Southern families put their sons on, and how he was really cared for and nurtured by both Black Mamba and Chin Chin Man. But you also see the weight of racism and its impact on Nana, even as a young child. When you tell a story about Nana playing in a soccer match where a parent on the opposing team is just hurling the most horrible racial slurs, and in that moment, you say, Nana ran onto the field, and for the rest of that half, he was little more than a blur, moving not with the elegance my father associated with soccer, but with pure fury, a fury that would come to define and consume him. Talk about how racism, again, impacts Nana as this young Black boy in the Southern town, and how he's seen, and how he feels like he has to show up in this space.
Yeah, I actually did an event recently where somebody brought up that moment, an audience member brought up that moment, and his reading of it was that Nana had kind of proved that man wrong, right? That it was that the triumph of his game that day was like a kind of a way to prove to that man who was uttering those slurs that he wasn't that thing. And I found that really interesting, because for me, what that moment depicts is like a great trauma that's occurring within Nana, that he feels the need to kind of prove himself at all, feels like a kind of violence to any young child, to have to experience that, take that moment in, and his response to it to be, okay, I've got to be better. That feels like a kind of trauma that he's going to be dealing with for the rest of this novel, certainly for the rest of his life. What I see in both Nana and Gifty, Nana certainly when it comes to sports, but Gifty more so when it comes to academia, is that they've really internalized a lot of this messaging around Black respectability politics, a lot of messaging around, you have to be twice as good to get half as far. Both of them are really, really kind of hyper focused on seeming, on being as good as possible so that they can be unimpeachable. But what we find throughout this novel is that it never protects them. Like, it's never enough for Nana to be excellent on the basketball court or on the soccer field. It's never enough for Gifty to be excellent in her studies. They're always going to be met with racism, because racism, again, it just is there. It's in the weather. There's no way for them to kind of avoid it, and there's no need for them to prove themselves better than it. It's trying to apply logic to an illogical system. You can't do it. And I don't think that Nana realizes it in that moment. I think Gifty starts to learn it a little later.
Yeah, and I think to your point, it's not only that they're trying to live up to this construct or ideal that they're never going to satisfy it because the bar is constantly being moved, but because of that stress of having to reach higher and higher to be approved of, it turns on Nana particularly, and it becomes a very inward sort of taking apart of who he was as a person that then exhibits through his addiction. So yeah. I think let's talk a little bit about, and I do want to go back to, you mentioned Chin Chin Man going back to Ghana and how he abandons his, leaving his family, but it's not an abandonment for just he left to leave. He left because he knew he didn't fit, and it was not right to keep trying to work the system. How does that departure throw the family off balance? And particularly with Nana, how does that departure shift who he is?
Yeah. Well, I was thinking about all of the narratives of the American dream that we hear so often here. You come, you work as hard as possible, you gain a foothold, and then if not you and your generation, by the next generation, everything will be fine. Like you'll have it made. And for so many, that's not the case. You come and you toil and you toil and you toil, and you feel like you're not really getting anywhere. And so, I know many people who end up returning to their home countries, but that's not a story that you see quite as often. And so I wanted to have that option of kind of seeing a case where the American dream gets subverted, where you see somebody decide that it's not worth it to stay. And in this particular case, absence becomes a kind of presence in the lives of all of these characters. We don't know very much about Gifty's mother. She's kind of, she's looms large in the novel, but because Gifty isn't very close to her emotionally, we never get that emotional presence with her either. And so we don't really get to see it spelled out for us what the Chin Chin Man leaving means to her. But I imagine it's a great grief. It's a great loss. We see it more with Nana, I think, because they were so close. There are lots of scenes of the Chin Chin Man kind of taking care of Nana and Gifty. He's the one with the more reasonable hours at work, so he can be present in a way that the mom can't be present. And I think that loss of him really starts to wear something away in Nana, and starts him down this path that ends really quite tragically.
Yeah, and so Nana then suffers an injury while he's playing basketball. And again, one of these where he had proven himself to be, the great savior of the local basketball team, and was getting adulation in town, from all corners of town, including the church that they belong to. And then he has this injury, and through a turn of events ends up addicted to OxyContin and eventually overdosing within a fairly short amount of time. It was only about 2 years. Yeah. So this leaves then just Gifty and her mother. And, she says early on in the book, for a long time, most of my life, in fact, it's been just me and her. But this pairing was unnatural. So talk about, again, how does Nana's death then shift that relationship yet again?
Yeah, I think Nana's death is the kind of central loss of this novel. There is a way to read this book as being about, again, all of these absences that feel like presences, and Nana's loss is the greatest absence, because we're in Gifty's perspective, and he's the person who has meant the most to her for most of her life. As I mentioned, her mother is a bit emotionally distant. Her father is literally absent. He's moved away. So Nana, in some ways, is the character who spends the most time getting to know Gifty and taking care of Gifty. He's the one who makes sure she has dinner when she comes home. He walks her home from school. He takes her out to color when their parents are fighting. Like he's doing a lot of that caretaking role that we expect out of parents in this particular family, because the parents can't or haven't been able to. So his loss is staggering for them, especially for the mother and for Gifty, and it creates this kind of chasm between these two women, because in some ways he was the connective tissue of this family. So without him, they forget, or they don't know how to relate to one another. So I see that distance between Gifty's mother and Gifty as kind of beginning with the loss of Nana, beginning with Nana's passing.
Interestingly, and I think you and I talked about this, but it also points out through his addiction and his passing, this codependency that the whole family sort of creates. It's very unnatural relationships. And so you have Gifty, who spends a lot of time sort of examining that when she came into the world and her mother was 40, and you could kind of tell she wasn't really looking for another child. And so she was even told by her mother that she was not a good baby. And then she was into this having to always prove that she was enough, but also to prove that she and her mother, after the death of her brother, that they were okay. So cleaning the house and making sure that everything was in order, so that as her mother would flow in and out of these depressive moments, that things would be as her mother would want it, so that the world would know that they were okay. Talk a bit about how, they may not have had a close relationship, but it was definitely a relationship in a very codependent way.
Yes, absolutely. It was a relationship that was kind of built on caretaking in some ways, built on these gestures that they could make toward one another, because again, they're not a very emotionally available pair, and they're not the kind of family that is going to vocalize their love for one another, but they are the kind of family that will bathe each other when one is low, or offer food when somebody needs it. So that kind of caretaking becomes the gestures that we see of love within this book. Gifty, I think of as a character who, because of all of the chaos of her childhood, has developed these, in my opinion, quite unhealthy coping mechanisms that involve kind of, as you said, that codependency of like making sure that everything looks as good as possible. She's very, very on the surface, like very, very placid, very put together, very ordered. But underneath the surface, there's so much pain there. But that she's not really addressing. What she does instead of addressing the pain is make sure that the house is neat so her mom won't complain. Make sure that that she's got the Bible next to her mother's bed so that when her mom wakes up, she'll see that she made that effort. So there's a way that those gestures kind of hinder her emotional well-being, hinder her own mental health. And in a novel that's so focused on the health and wellness of everybody else, I think what's clear to me is that Gifty herself is struggling, but nobody is attentive to that. So we see that in those moments.
Yeah, it's and I have to ask you a bit of a process question at this point, because a lot has been written about the depth of the neuroscience that you've put in this book, as Gifty, as she's working on her doctorate in neuroscience, is working with these mice, and it's amazing. But I will tell you what struck me was just the depths of the pain and the trauma inside of the family, with the abandonment and the depression and the codependency and the addiction. And I guess my question for you is, how do you develop these types of characters with this much complexity and maintain your own equilibrium while you're at it, because it's a very heavy, these are several very heavy topics in one space that you're writing, creating a narrative around.
Yeah, it's true. And with my first novel as well, I have kind of tended to go into quite dark places. I think, just out of my own personal interests and obsessions. But writing in some ways, I think, is itself like the way that I create order and create sense and kind of process. And so the writing always feels, at least, not necessarily like escapist, but it feels like it's allowing me to kind of plunge into a place that feels safe and ordered and makes a kind of sense. So um, the writing never feels difficult in the same way that the research does. I always say this for Homegoing, and it's true of Transcendent Kingdom too. When I'm researching a novel, when I'm kind of reading about, in the case of Homegoing, enslavement and the transatlantic slave trade and people, life on the plantation, the Fugitive Slave Act, when I'm reading about those things, I'm never able to kind of console myself that it's made up in the way that I can with the fiction. When I'm reading that nonfiction and kind of trying to get into the heads of real people, I'm always aware of the fact that these are very real circumstances. And similarly with Transcendent Kingdom, I was reading and watching a lot of material that had to do with people suffering from addiction, people going through these really, really low points in their lives. And again, like it's real people. I can't put that aside. I can't forget that this is that even if I'm making fiction out of it, that this is a real phenomenon. And that always, I think, that keeps a kind of balance. Like the writing becomes about like trying to honor the stories of the real people, and that I think keeps me measured in some way.
Yeah. You also did have to internalize, or at least internalize enough to be able to put it on paper, a lot of this neuroscience as well. And I'm curious how difficult it is to be able to take such, very heavy technical information and be able to process it in a way that the average reader is able to understand what Gifty was, what the hypothesis that Gifty was trying to work through with these mice in order to come up with her own answers around addiction and pleasure.
Yeah, this was one of the greatest pleasures of writing this novel for me, actually, because I hadn't taken a science class since college, and I'm not a scientist at all. But the way that I came to this science is that my childhood friend is a neuroscientist, and she works on this very phenomenon, reward-seeking behavior in mice. And so I kind of approached it as an opportunity to get to know what she did. And because I am a layperson, again, because I'm not the kind of person who is steeped in this material, like everything was so new for me, but it also allowed me kind of a clear path toward writing it with clarity, writing it in a way that people could understand. Because I only have such a limited understanding of this science myself. And so always kind of keeping my own interest in it front of mind, and recognizing that, the more technical something got, the more difficult it would be for me to understand, kind of kept me grounded. There was never a chance of this novel being so technical that lay people couldn't understand it, because I was never going to understand the science to that degree. My bigger fear was that scientists would read it and be like, "What?" But thankfully, that friend read it and felt like it spoke to her work as well. So it was a balance.
Well, from the lay reader, I think you did an amazing job, because it all sounded incredibly believable and very process oriented, and you could really see how Gifty was moving through these various experiments with the mice. But also, there was an interesting way of watching how she was using that same hypothesis model for examining herself and understanding where she had been as this youngest child who was thrust into this caretaker role with her mother, but also realizing how, for as much as she may have been not close to her mother, but in a lot of ways was becoming very like her mother. And she talked about the callousness and she talked about the hardening. Could you talk a little bit more about Gifty's own sort of reckoning with who she was and who her mother was?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is one of the most interesting things that that happens in novels or any kind of media about mother-daughter relationships or father-son relationships. This idea that these parents have kind of created a mold that we're expected to grow into, to fit into. And Gifty at one point even talks about how before puberty she just looked like herself, and after puberty she started to look like her mother. So in some ways, she's starting to kind of physically fit that mold that her mother leaves. I think Gifty is a character who would greatly protest being compared to her mother, who would greatly protest anyone saying that she was like her mother. And yet some of these words that I used to describe her mother, reticent, emotionally unavailable, those could be used for Gifty as well. You know, she's developed in some ways, despite her best intentions, she has developed similar ways of seeing the world and interacting with the world as her mother. The other thing I think is really interesting about mother-daughter relationships or books that kind of deal with this subject matter is thinking about that point that we all come to if we're lucky enough to have our parents in our lives and lucky enough to get to see them into old age. There's a point where you do find yourself having to take care of your parents. You know, you find yourselves having to kind of parent the people who parented you in some ways, mother the person who mothered you in some ways. Gifty is doing it a little younger than maybe she would otherwise because her mother is ill, but she's still finding herself having to make decisions about her mother's care. And so that role reversal, that feels like a really interesting place to press, an interesting point to think about, because it is kind of common to all of us. You know, at some point, our parents, our the older generations will need care, and you have to start thinking about what that looks like.
Yeah. I found it interesting with Gifty as she's exploring and becoming who she is throughout the book. And, you know, she talks about her time in undergrad and she went as far from Alabama as she possibly could have by going to California. But even being in those spaces in, you know, almost like trying on new shoes and, you know, trying to be fun at the party, even though it felt uncomfortable, and, you know, making connections with people that she, you know, would not necessarily have made connections with. But I thought it was interesting that her first boyfriend, Raymond, who was the son of a preacher, ended up being sort of very patterned towards what she knew as opposed to going into this new space, versus Han, who she was in the same research lab with. Talk a little bit about her relationship with Raymond and how that sort of mirrored some of the other relationships.
Yeah, Raymond becomes her first like serious or first real relationship. And poor Raymond, you know, he just kind of meets her at a place in her life where she isn't really ready, I think, to receive what he wants from her. He tries to draw her out, you know, he tries to include her with his friends. But again, I don't think that Gifty is emotionally healthy enough to kind of meet him where he is. She's still very fresh in her grief, in part, I think, because she doesn't talk very much about her brother and about what his loss has meant to her. Before we meet Raymond, we meet Anne, who is likely Gifty's first kind of romantic relationship, who has a similar role. You know, she tries to get her to talk about her life, tries to get her to talk about her brother, and Gifty has developed this callus around her brother's death. She doesn't want it pressed. She doesn't want to examine it. She doesn't want to talk about it. So in that way, Raymond and Anne kind of get kicked to the curb, I think undeservedly so. And Han, who never really probes Gifty in that way, and who can kind of meet Gifty where she is because he speaks this language of science that feels neutral and safe to her. He gets in where they can't, just really by dint of being able to kind of communicate with her on that level. So I don't necessarily think that Han was like a kinder person than Raymond, but I think he just kind of played a longer game, a slower game, and Gifty was was ready to receive that.
Right. Well, and he was definitely a different personality as well, because Raymond was much more of an outgoing type, and and Han, from him blushing and his ears turning red anytime he was asked something that embarrassed him, but he just seemed like a quieter personality, and maybe that was something she felt more comfortable with him because of that. Like she didn't have to sort of reach a level like she did with Raymond in order to be in that space.
Yeah, exactly.
So, well, I know we're going to start with questions shortly, but I did want to make sure that we touched on Gifty's mother and her depression, particularly because Gifty's mother hated therapy, didn't believe in mental illness, and refused to name the illness depression, which makes it hard if you're not going to name it to actually do something about it. And so Gifty's mother really found her refuge in outside of the silences, outside of the periods where she just stayed in bed, inside of her own mind. And as you said in that first chapter, where she was, in bed indefinitely still, but wild inside, but outside of those periods, she was very heavily involved with her church. So talk about, I think, not only the relationship of the church this family has as a haven, but in a lot of ways, it was harmful as well.
Yes. So Gifty's mother is incredibly devout, and she's devout in Ghana. She talks about how she prayed and prayed and prayed for Nana. As you mentioned, she calls Nana her Isaac. So she has this deep faith that has kind of carried her through every other difficult point in her life. When they come to Alabama, they're coming to a place that has very few other Ghanaians, but they're also coming to a place that is kind of de facto segregated. And so Gifty's family ends up living on the white side of town. And because Gifty's mother, I think, is not incredibly well versed in the kind of racial dynamics of this place, she just kind of chooses the first church that speaks to her, a church on her side of town. So Gifty and her family wind up at this predominantly white church. And what Gifty and Nana realize sooner, I think, than Gifty's mother realizes, is that you can't escape the racism of the country just by going to this church. Like, that God is not enough in some ways to kind of cover that for them. So the church, in some ways, it is still a comfort to Gifty's mother. She still is quite plugged in. She has this relationship with Pastor John, who becomes the only person in her grief to see her and take care of her from that church. But at the same time, it's the church who, where Gifty hears these whisperings about her brother, these racist whisperings about her brother. It's the church where she kind of starts to recognize racism in ways that she hadn't seen it before. And so as it heals, as it provides, it also kind of starts to undercut and to hurt, particularly Gifty and Nana. And so it's this double-edged sword, but that faith is still so strongly alive in her mother, and it is kind of the only area where she's willing to examine her depression. As you said, she doesn't name it depression, she won't call it depression, but she does think of it as something to give to God, as something that God can take care of. So that's like the place that Gifty can meet her mother where she is through that faith.
So I want to read a comment that was provided by one of the audience members in the comments that you made just now about the caretaking. And the person says, as a long-term caretaker of a family member with mental health issues and someone who has lost a parent, and I cannot attest to the neuroscience component, I want to thank you for writing a book that feels truly autobiographical. And I'll say to you, I think, in my reading of the book, and I mentioned to you, I happened to be reading the book when I was asked to do this. And I ran into a friend of mine yesterday in Beaufort, which is about an hour and a half from here. And she's been reading the book and didn't know. And we were all sort of talking about how personal it felt for various aspects of our own lives in the way that you wrote the characters. So thank you very much for making this really feel, honor, as you said, honor the stories of the people who are dealing with these traumatic issues.
Thank you. That means a lot to me. I mean, I do think there are are many of us who are going through similar circumstances as the ones in the book, and it is an area that's still so kind of shrouded with silence and sometimes with shame. And so I've heard from many audience members who have said they haven't had the opportunity to kind of talk about these moments in their lives, and so I'm glad that the book has kind of brought this to the fore. That means a lot to me. Thank you for that comment.
Absolutely. So our first question is, if you could expand any of the Homegoing characters into his or her own novel, which would you choose?
I think if I could, I would focus on Willie's chapter, which is a chapter that takes place during the Great Migration. Willie and Robert, her husband, move from the South to Harlem because Willie wants to sing, but Willie finds herself too dark for the opportunities that Harlem affords, whereas Robert is so light-skinned that he could pass. And I find passing stories really fascinating. They're kind of uniquely American stories as well. Like, you don't see passing in other cultures and other countries as much as here. And so what interests me about this moment is that there's a point at the end of the novel where Willie sees Robert across the street, and he's standing there with his white wife and his white child, and she knows that he's Black. And I always wonder what would happen if I had like moved down Robert's side of the lineage. You know, if I had seen Robert's children growing up with Robert, not knowing that he was passing. What happens to that family tree? What happens to that branch that grows up believing that they're white? That would be a place I'd be interested in. I don't know if I'll ever write it, but I do think about it sometimes.
Well, I think that's a fascinating exploration. You know, anytime I hear that storyline, I always think of that old movie, Imitation of Life, which I don't know if you've seen it or not. It was something that I remember seeing in my youth, and it was about a very fair-skinned woman who had a dark-skinned mother, and the interplay between the two of them. So, and I still hear stories contemporarily about that same, you know, particularly as people are testing their DNA and finding out more about where they came from than they knew.
Absolutely. I think it's happening more and more often that people's kind of these Pandora's boxes are being opened. There's a great novel by Nella Larson called Passing that just got turned into a movie. I think you can see it on Netflix soon, if not now.
Yeah. So we have another question. The audience member is asking if you would speak about the book's title, Transcendent Kingdom. Why did you choose this title to tie this highly complex, multidimensional narrative together?
I really struggled with naming this novel, mostly I think in part because with my first novel, Homegoing, I had a title that I thought was the title, and it was kind of my working title for 7 years, and then suddenly, really at the last minute, it switched to Homegoing. Homegoing started to feel more appropriate, more right. And so I assumed something similar would happen with Transcendent Kingdom. I had first, it was untitled for much of the writing, and then I came to this point where Gifty's reflecting on a high school teacher who said that Homo sapiens are the only animals to believe that they have transcended their kingdom. She's talking about, you know, the kind of scientific classification, kingdom, phylum, class, order. Homo sapiens are the only animal to believe that they are not animals. And I found that really interesting. And it felt like it was kind of tying together some of the ideas of this novel. You know, questions about how to make sense of a life in which senseless things happen, questions about what it means to be human. And so I added that as the title, worked that way for many years, and thought it would change, and then it just never changed. So it stuck.
Wonderful. So another question from the audience. What are you working on now?
I am working on something. I'm too superstitious to say what it is. I also, now that I have 2 novels worth of experience behind me, one thing that I recognize about myself is that beginnings are very, very hard, and they kind of feel almost like I'm walking toward a mirage. Is it real? Is it not real? Like it's always really hard to know when I'm at the beginning stages of a book. So really anything I could say would prove to be a lie by the time the book came out. So I'll just say something is happening, but it's hard to know yet what it is.
It's in there and it wants to come out. We just don't know what it looks like.
Yeah, that's exactly it. Yeah.
I am curious though, if you find now, having done 2 books, how has your process in writing changed?
It hasn't changed too dramatically. I still again have trouble with trouble with the beginnings. At some point, like once I like feel like I kind of recognize the novel, that's the only way I can put it. It's like I'll have a moment where it feels like, oh, there you are, that's the book. Once I have that feeling, both times, like I can carry it through to the end just based on that feeling alone. But until I get to that point, it's kind of like pulling teeth to put the words down. Yeah, but I think what I've learned is that I can trust the process, that the words will come when it's the right book.
Right. So one other question from the audience: what does literary success look like to you?
Oh, well, it's been kind of beyond my wildest dreams. The success of both of these books, the success of my career. You know, I've wanted to be a writer my whole life, and what that meant for me when I was a child was just to get to sit down and write these little stories in my journal. I didn't really have great visions about what a literary career would look like, what literary success would look like. I just wanted to read and to write, and I wanted to be read. And so to be here now in a place where so many people have read my books is huge. And that feels like the most important aspect of this literary success, is that there are readers like all of you who get to connect with these things that just existed in my head for years and years. That feels like a great gift to me.
Great. So I have one last question from the audience, and then I'm going to have one last question before we close, because we've got about 8 minutes left. So this last question from the audience: how much self-editing were you personally responsible for? I was impressed by the book's length, but equally superb depth.
Oh, thank you. Well, I have to say, like, I'm a pretty concise writer just by nature. I have a lot of writer friends who will write hundreds and hundreds of pages and then kind of have to revise it down. That has never happened to me. I generally, get the feedback from editors and other readers that I need to expand things, that I need to add more. I tend toward concision and precision in my writing, in great part because I find revising kind of excruciating. So I want the first draft to look as close to the end, to be as close to the end as possible. With Transcendent Kingdom, the hardest aspect of self-editing, I guess, was trying to figure out, because it's nonlinear, trying to figure out how to make that structure move in a way that was still propulsive, but that wasn't kind of relying on the on the shoulders of linearity. And so it felt, I compare it to a game of Jenga. Like I just felt like if I moved any piece of this novel, the whole thing would collapse. That was the hardest thing for me when it came to editing. But as far as the short length and the depth, I think that's just how I kind of naturally work.
Yeah. Well, and you mentioned this Jenga puzzle of making the, looking back, in present day and looking back, making it all fit together. And that actually fits perfectly with, I think, my last question, which is that, when we come to the end of this story, you have Gifty has married Han, and she's got her goal of having the research lab at Princeton. And she's even sort of reset her relationship with the church, which we didn't have a chance to get into in depth. But, this isn't really, though, a sort of like a tidy bow on the end of the story. I mean, I sense that there might be still some underlying, maybe uneasy piece with what is. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah. I wanted the ending to feel The way I've been describing it is like that last pose in yoga where you're just like lying flat on the mat.
In your
You know,
Savasana.
exactly. Like she's just there. You know, the world is still like swirling around her, and she still is going to have to get up at some point and kind of deal again with all of these questions that have been churning for the entirety of the novel. But in that one little glimpse of her, you get to feel her experience some measure of calm and some measure of peace. And that felt like something she deserved, frankly, after so much chaos.
Yeah, I completely agree. Well, yeah, this has been an absolutely fascinating and engaging and emotional conversation. It's such a deep and engaging work that you've brought forward, and I can't thank you enough for Transcendent Kingdom again, just personally as someone who read it and really resonated with the characters and the topics and the emotion of it. So thank you so much for that. And thank you very much to our audience for joining us today. You can see the handshakes and the love that's floating up. So I think we can all say that we really enjoyed this hour that went very quickly to get today. So for our audience members, you can purchase Transcendent Kingdom through the Charleston Literary Festival website. That's charlestonliteraryfestival.com. Thank you so much for joining us today. And on behalf of the festival, we do hope that you will continue to participate in the Charleston Literary Festival with the events that are both in person here in Charleston, as well as those that are online over the next week. Again, I'm Kerri Forrest. It's been my pleasure to be the interlocutor today. And yeah, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Kerri. Thanks, everyone.